Can I introduce you to Susan Rugh, his mother, and the Dean of Undergraduate Education? Is that your title?
Yeah.
Yep, okay, here she is, thanks.
I know he'll get mad at me later if I don't give him enough time. But it's a pleasure to be here. You know about him, and I'll read what has been prepared, and then I'll say what I'd like to say. So Jacob Sterling Rugh, named for my father, who was a college professor, is an assistant professor of sociology here, and he came in 2012, and I just want all of you to know that that was the year I was in Washington, D.C., and I had nothing to do with it. I give Renata all the credit. He received a dual master's degree in public affairs and urban and regional planning at Princeton at the Wilson School, and a PhD in public affairs. His research focuses on race, space, and immigration, with an emphasis on housing segregation and home ownership. His most recent publication, Race, Space, and Cumulative Disadvantage, a case study of the subprime lending collapse, won the Law and Society Association's John Hope Franklin Prize for the best article on race and racism this year, so way to go. Well, here at BYU, he teaches courses on multicultural America, introductory sociology, race and ethnicity, and urban sociology. And we often get a message from him with a link, and he's a favorite on the program that Julie Rose hosts. What's the name of it? Top of the Mind on BYU Radio, and he also, I know, was interviewed this week by somebody from Baltimore Public Radio. He enjoys participating in the Africana Studies program and Black History Month events at BYU, and he's also done some trainings on race for BYU advisors, and that's part of what you'll see today. Now I'm going to say what I would like to say. So there's no greater validation than having your offspring walk in your footsteps, and it's a genuine pleasure for me to have lunch once a week. I always pay, of course, with Jake. To take Jake to lunch once a week, and he's often helped me with my work when I'll call him up and say, I'm studying these Patels who own motels. How many Patels are there in the United States? And he'll get back to me, and he's been really helpful. So it wasn't obvious from the beginning that he would follow in my footsteps. When he was a very small child, though, we knew that he was quantitatively gifted. I was probably 3 or 4 when I said, eat your vegetables on your plate. And he said, I ate 83% of my peas. This is a family story. So we call him Mr. 83%. In his teenage years, he was always successful in school, and he ran track, and we were pals. And I know one night we were walking back from the corner store. We lived in a walkable environment on the south side of Chicago where he was raised, and he was raised near the University of Chicago, and then his father was Bishop of a ward where we had 18 missionaries because we opened up the whole south side to missionary work at that time. And I was nearing the end of my PhD, and as is customary, you go out for job interviews the year before you're done, and I went out for some job interviews, and then I got the word that I did not get those jobs, and I was walking along with him one night, and I turned to him and I said, Jake, I didn't get that job I wanted. And Jake turns to me and says, I'm sorry, Mom, I'm never getting a PhD. Well, he's since had to eat his words, thanks to the help of Eric Eide in the econ department at BYU and his education at Princeton, and mostly his wonderful wife, Katie. So I will say in seriousness that he has achieved what he has through and that I just want to tell the college committee he's eminently deserving of tenure, if any of you are here, that his intellectual and personal achievements come because he is a man of character, the topic today. And he's also father to half of our 10 grandchildren. So I introduce Jake Rugh.
So one of my students, it's obviously always the little one here. One of my students told me, quote unquote, you can have two of these, huh? One of my students said on their evaluation, "You lived it, you learned it, you love it, you teach it." Okay, and that's kind of why I'm here today. Jonathan, in the global issues thing, I don't think he's here, said that is the number one thing that motivates him every day here at BYU. His core values around diversity and inclusion. So I've tailored my talk. I've tried to make it even better, even smarter for the audience here today, around why race matters and the implications for exactly what we're doing and making this presentation absolutely unique to our setting here at BYU and what we're doing. Okay, so I have a little outline for you. I want to talk very briefly about diversity in the church, just so we have some numbers. I'm going to start with the kind of demography type of training I have, 30,000 feet. And then I'm going to go into what we teach in one of my classes. I'm going to talk about the students that I teach. What I teach, I'm focused on 3 major lessons that the students get about 3 major racial method groups. And then I want to spend most of the time in terms of where you're thinking, your questions, your discussion, is on how do we make this work? How do we reframe and understand identity? How do we help students see that there's a mutual obligation, give and take that I'll define? And I have an example, and then I want to hear from you and your examples. And I've heard already from more than half a dozen of you in my conversations over the last few years about this issue. Okay? So from 1980 to 2014, we did an absolute flip from 58% of the members being here in the U.S. to now 58% of the members of LDS Church being outside of the U.S. So most people who are LDS have never been to the United States, right? Okay, let alone the Intermountain West. Similarly, here we see in the United States, keeping in mind that the 3 fastest growing states that the U.S. Census Bureau says every single year, right, are Utah, Arizona, right, and Nevada. So we're talking about a quick moving benchmark here. Despite all the rapid growth in the Mormon and non-Mormon population in these states, there's more Mormons today, right? About 2.5 times as many as there used to be outside of this traditional Mormon corridor, right, that Brigham Young colonies. So about me, building on what my mom talked about, we were there at the time that people said, you know, the field is black, right? The field's not white, the field is black already to harvest. And we had a very multicultural ward, and when I share this with my students, I do it on the very second day of class. This is me and my high school track team. Our high school is about 85% black, which was integrated because it wasn't 100% black, 100% like the other high schools. I went to track meets where I was the only white person within, you know, a square mile or so. And I wrote about that experience for my BYU essay. I went back and counted and saw that there's still very stable integration. What used to be a tiny branch now is 2 wards in the entire state, especially with all the growth in the Latino population there as well. But this was a transformative experience. You know, growing up as a child, this was very indirect, always seeing a black man as the source of good gifts and everything good as Santa, right? But what was direct and what I do remember is passing the sacrament and looking up on the stand and seeing a counselor from Hong Kong, a counselor who was a black Korean War veteran, right? Relief Society president whose grandmother was a slave and who talked about that, and so on and so forth, right? Somebody who was from Spain. And that had a profound impact on me, and that was the type of diversity and inclusion that I'm talking about in today's talk, where people made hard decisions to call people into callings when they were brand new. They could have just done things the way they'd always done things, an easy way, just called all the Utah migrants to fill all the callings, but they didn't, okay? And people like Kathy Stokes were there. So we had this chapel built right before I moved away from there, okay? And I go back and count things because of what Robert Putnam said, right? I can't just get nostalgic up here. Went back and saw that it's still a stable integration. And when I went to that sacrament meeting, it was a young woman who was African American whose brother was on a mission in Mississippi, a white male who was a convert, and then an Asian American high counselor, right? So that was that diversity that I was talking about. Okay. So how this matters, if you think about Jabari Parker, he's somebody who embodies all the hypotheses that I showed my students about how diversity matters, race, segregation, the rise of immigration through his mother's side, immigrant from Tonga, and now that he's single and in the NBA, right, he's a young single adult, and that's driving a lot of the Christian growth in the church, right? These young singles who are highly educated, men and women marrying at a later age and so forth. And when he talks in this clip that I'm not going to show for the sake of time, people ask him, is that weird, right, to be Mormon? He says, yeah, it is, right? And his high school is an all-black high school. And he says, they think that we make our own furniture, right? So they're confusing the Mormons with the Amish right off. And he says, and most people, when they think of a Mormon, they would look at a white guy. That's exactly what he said, word for word. He said, but it's worldwide, okay? So he's somebody who is self-identifies as black, who's from a very racially isolated neighborhood, but he has a connection through his mother, the church, his congregation. He was the bishop's home teaching companion for many years. He has a connection to a much larger sphere, and this is this sense of integration that I was talking about, where this social institution, a white church, was the most integrated place for those white graduate students, for those African Americans who lived on the South Side. And they all say this in their retrospective life histories, that this was that unique institution. Right? Okay, so that's where I'm coming from, a very interesting background that doesn't say that I'm special. What it says is that it's very typical that blacks and whites and other groups live separated lives and separated experiences in this country due to segregation. Let's look at BYU now. We can see that these are the numbers of racial and ethnic minorities in absolute figures. And I had to call and send lots of emails to get these data before they came out. And they took a long time to release them, and I finally figured out why. Can anybody guess why they didn't release them right away? Because the categories are different, right? So how we count race and measure it changes over time, right? Which is kind of lesson number one with my students. So I just allocated this multiracial group based on what the shares were, which is a naive approach, of course, but we don't know what the shares are, right? So Latinos and multiracial individuals are the two biggest minority groups. Okay? And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on Latinos in part 2 of my talk today. So we've had some modest rises in diversity. If you look at Princeton University, its number of black students went from about 350 to 400. It's, of course, a much smaller school. Blacks are a bigger share. But the big rise in diversity has come from the Asian American and the Latino segment in higher education overall in the U.S. Okay? And that's true here at BYU as well. Okay? So to say BYU is a white school does a disservice to the students that are here. Okay? So in my classes, I'm lucky. I have a selection bias, right? Where people look at the title that says Multicultural America, right? Maybe I went on a mission somewhere, or I have something in my background with a grandparent, or I'm a child of an immigrant. So I have a more racially diverse class, and because I asked them specifically, how do you self-identify, how do your parents self-identify, I can back out, and I've asked a sample now of over 600 students, everything about them, their zip code, their social class, their background, and I can get a better figure, and 1 in 10 are multiracial. Here's a student of mine who's going to be the TA for the new incoming professor who teaches this class. The type of student that stayed after every class, right, asking lots of students. She is Fijian, and she is white. Okay? And she had a lot of experiences growing up where her friends said, you're white because, of how you talk. And she said, oh, so there's a certain way of talking this way. And so she had a lot of experiences babysitting and encounters with race where she was on the spectrum. And a lot of our multiracial students really take a lot of strength from the narrative of the historical Black Latter-day Saints, the Mexican-American Latter-day Saints, and they attach themselves to this story. And they see themselves on a spectrum. And when they come here to these classes, they really start to say, I want to embrace both parts of my heritage, right? So on one side, I go back to the pioneers, on the other side, my dad's a convert, right? They want to embrace all of who they are, right? But most of them in the West have gone to majority white high schools, right? Majority white environment, right? The values whiteness over everything else. So it's a very interesting experience for these students, and I'll come back to a couple more of them later on. So these are different benchmarks, how you can measure things. Again, we're moving slowly towards diversity, but my point of my talk is diversity is not enough. Okay? So I want to plant these questions. What's meaningful racial integration? How do we facilitate this, right? How do we feel about this? Do our students know it's important? If they don't know it's important, we don't, then what do we need to do differently? Okay, I'll come back to that. And hopefully there'll be some amount of persuasion, right? So let me tell you about the courses I teach. So most of the students that I teach are not sociology students, even though all the courses listed are in sociology. Because these two classes have 60 to 180 students in them. And they are mainly there to get their GE credit and to get the grade and to not get anything below a C-, right, and be done, okay, when they start. They say that. I asked them, why are you here? And that's what they say, right, to get the credit, okay? When they're done, they say something very different. Pre-med, all pre-med students now have to take sociology. It's on the MCAT exam, and that's great because the pre-med students say, hey, you show me a video, you tug at my heartstrings, now show me some data, right? So I really like those students. Race and ethnicity, the global cultural awareness credit is filled with that, Africana studies, and in urban sociology, some of my very best students that I've had are the planning students from geography. They've been absolutely excellent, okay? So these are the different books that we study. I'm going to pass around a few of these at certain times during my talk. So I want to focus on Social 323 because I want to go for depth instead of just covering everything a little bit and we don't get anything from it. They understand how race is a social construct. We'll only spend one slide on that. All of you are very familiar with that. We connect race, immigration to racial formation in the post-1965 context. And I'm going to give two examples with Asian Americans and Latino Americans to try to help you make sense of how race matters. Comes out of that. And then the students, what they're doing all the time through all their activities that I will list later, is they're initiating a path to racial reconciliation, race relations, all the things that we say in society should do. We try to walk the talk and make the students practice it on a small scale, okay? And that's what we're doing throughout the entire class, okay? This battery is getting a little bit low. Okay, so very simplistic. This is the 100 level thing. At the 300 and of course the 600 level, we can spend weeks on this. But students first understand that when Irish Americans say, right, we were slaves and we're a minority group, that was more true in terms of race in the 1800s than it is in the 2000s. Because today, the next day, and I'm from Chicago where the river is green and the milk in the supermarket is green on St. Patrick's Day, right? The next day, they are not Irish American. They are what? They're just white, okay? And that is part of, right, the privilege of symbolic ethnicity. You can put it on, take it off, okay? And there's, of course, a spectrum, right? Where black Americans on one end, white Americans on another, and other groups are in the middle, right? Where they experience both ethnicity and race. So the students start to understand that we've made laws. We've had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've had the Virginia Colony. All of these things are in the DNA of the country that make race in terms of assigning it, imposing it, and so forth. And that's not the same thing as saying, I really like that I lived in Chile and I have a great-grandparent who's, right, Chileno, and now I eat empanadas, right? That's a different type of symbolic ethnicity. Okay, so we get this out of the way to start with. We use the cases of Bhagat Singh Thin, Tagawa Zawa in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court had different reasoning on why they could be white, why they weren't white, and they understand this construction of race and whiteness. Okay? So that's kind of one of the first things. Now, the three lessons really wanted to teach some content right when I'm up here today. And the first one is a structural argument that belongs to Jennifer Lee and Min Jo, who are at the top of their field and have researched for decades in all the top journals and all the top university presses their books. So I lend a lot of credence to their argument. It is just one argument. It's a very structural one. But they point out, first of all, that the majority of these immigrants from Korea and China are college educated, whereas in a society like China, only 5% of the population is. Right? So we're getting a very select segment of the population. And that 100 years ago, the Chinese in the Mississippi Delta and the San Francisco Chinatowns were treated like African Americans. Had that Chinese migration continued, they would have had a much more experience like black Americans. But that today, their experience is much closer to that of white Americans. And of course, in many ways, it's not the same, which is very important. And what they point out is that in the 1960s, we rewrote the laws to favor family reunification and high-skilled immigration, and societies like Canada have even more weight on that high skill. And that created an effect. It created a media narrative. Time Magazine, U.S. News and World Report saying that the Japanese Americans made it without the help of anybody else, right? And pitting these different minority groups against one another. They've studied this and looked globally, right? I want to bring in the global since I went to that panel. And they find that the Chinese in Spain mimic the Cubans in America. They mimic the Salvadorans here. They go after small business ownership, entrepreneurship. These things as a strategy for mobility. They don't go after postgraduate degree as a strategy for mobility. They're stratified below the Ecuadorians in Spain and so forth, right? There's nothing genetic or essential about this. It doesn't have to do with counting rice or Confucian culture, because this applies to all the Asian subgroups, such as those who have a Hindu background, right? So I'm going to pass out these handouts in a minute. What they find in their book, which is really important and interesting, and I want to make sure I pass this around, is that the really damaging thing in the whole second half of the book is social psychology, is that Asian Americans, even if they make six figures, if they don't get into this very tight success frame, which they call it, of getting, you know, medicine, law, engineering, postgraduate degree, and they go to an Ivy League or elite Stanford institution, they question their own identity. They say, I'm the whitest Chinese guy you'll ever meet, right? Or I don't even know if I'm Asian American, right? So they point out there's a core problem with racializing academic achievement, right? And on the West Coast, we know that academic achievement has been racialized as the Asian thing now, right? It's not the white thing anymore. And so they go into all these different findings, and the students bring up all different great counterexamples of, you know, serving with the Hmong or people being Asian refugees themselves and talking about how this doesn't apply to all Asian Americans, and they bring that up in the conclusion of the book. And it's a great discussion. And I had a student who served near the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, which, as you know, is one of the premier medical institutions in the world. She said the most intelligent, smartest person she ever taught on her mission was an immigrant from India, and he recounted an experience where he was run off the road by a driver in a pickup truck into a ditch, pinned under his motorcycle where he thought he would die. And he was telling the person to go back where you came from, right? And you don't belong here, right? So even when people have a higher income and educational attainment than the reference group of the white mainstream, they still face racism, right? Okay, so the students understand these concepts and they bring it up. And of course, most immigrants come from Asia today, and we talk about the I Am campaign, and we use the videos, and the kids have a lot of it, and the students do a great job with that, okay? So the second myth I want to dispel is the idea of the iconic ghetto, and I'm going to define that precisely in a moment, and I'm going to share an experience from the BYU student who lived this. So most blacks in the United States live in the suburbs, just like most immigrants, all groups. Most blacks are not poor, even though their poverty rate is twice that of other groups. Black segregation has come down tremendously. In the 1970s, blacks universally in all metros were segregated. Today it's much more varied. We've done specific research on this. And most of our students come from these types of areas like Riverside, California, and so forth, that are much more multi-ethnic today and much more integrated. But the fact that African Americans, especially in the largest cities, are highly segregated matters to black Americans everywhere. And it matters to, right, my student who's from Mozambique who, right, grew up in Gilbert, Arizona, right? It matters to all black Americans no matter their background. I'll show you why, okay? Elijah Anderson is kind of an elder statesman, sociologist, ethnographer, qualitative methods, and since I do so much quantitative, I give my students a lot of qualitative to read. And he has the argument about the iconic ghetto that flows from W.E. Du Bois and many others. He says that, you know, we've had all these gains with the rise of the black middle class and gains of women in the workplace. So the workplace seems a lot more integrated, but blacks still encounter problems in the white space, right? And there's an asymmetry that's fundamental, right? So that our new faculty member who's joining this fall, who's biracial, right, black and white, has to navigate successfully the white spaces of higher education and so forth to be successful, right? But whites in our society do not need to learn how to navigate a black space, right, in terms of a black neighborhood. They don't see that it's economically integrated, right, that it has, most of the people are abiding by the law, right? All these other stereotypes are busted. And so what happens is that the iconic ghetto becomes this new type of color line. It's social, it's physical, it's cultural, it's through rap music, it's through a lot of different things. And since people don't have a lot of real life experience like we had in the Hyde Park Ranch, right, they have a stereotype, right? They have a stereotype. And this affects all black Americans because we don't create segregation physically through laws, but the segregation that still exists physically in a place like Philadelphia affects blacks everywhere. So I had a student who was from Idaho, who was adopted, who self-identifies as black, and she was a wonderful student. She was a psychology major in my class. And she came to one of my trainings and shared this experience that where she grew up, she was like the only black girl, right? So everybody knew her on an individual level because she really stood out. And her family learned, was very culturally competent, and had a great experience. But when she came to BYU, all of that fell apart. And everybody said, what? Well, you must be able to play basketball well, right? You must be the best dancer, right? And so on and so forth. And they never got to know her for who she was, right? And lo and behold, not only is she black, she's Afro-Latina, right, as well. And she served a mission in Mexico. And she feels a lot of connection to the multiple groups. And when she took this class, she said, now I know what to say to other people. And I know that I can be an agent for change where I educate others and I speak about things and articulate them in a way that edifies, right, and brings us both up to a better understanding. And she understands that it's structural, that it stems from this spatial segregation, right, that it's not just so-and-so has a weird personality, right? And so she found a lot of healing in this class, and she was one of many others. So he says we got to have close range, civil contact. He finds people practicing this on the streets of Philadelphia, and we try to practice that with our students in our class, right? And our classes are much more multiracial, okay? So now I'm going to spend more time on the Latino experience for a reason, okay? And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I'm going to do that here. And I'm going to try to motivate it, okay? Okay. So first off, Latinos are the largest racial and ethnic group. There are over 55 million Latinos in the United States. Number 2, Latinos embody the origin story of America. And this is not an original argument. There's a young woman in the New York Times video, Conversations on Racism in Google, who said, being Latina is phenomenal, right? Because it embodies how America began, right? These people coming together, okay, to create what is Latino, okay? Another reason is that throughout history, we've seen all these different points in time where we have made race when it comes to Latinos through laws and policies that I'll talk about in a moment. Number 4, the Latino story shares a lot in common with Asian Americans, Black Americans, white Americans. We had large-scale immigration of Mexicans during the 1910s and 20s when we had Italians in the Northeast. And so students can say, all right, now I can start to use Latinos to understand everything else I've learned in the class and use a comparison. And what's so cool about it is it's just like why people who aren't LDS are studying the LDS as a global religion, because it's all happening right now, in real time, right? Like in 2016, the talking heads, the things that are said about Latinos, all this is happening right now, so students really like the dynamic approach to this part of our class, okay? And so they say a lot about what our nation's racial future will be, the choices they make, especially their children who are very likely to be multiracial as a result of intermarriage. And there's a lot of good and bad news, and so we try to explore this as we go about this in our class. So in our course, by the way, we also talk about Arab Americans, so I'll pass it around. So in our class, we, maybe you guys can stagger these books. Bruce, maybe you can start some of the other books. We talk about the idea of Christina Moore, and I really want the historians to pay attention to this one. She talks about the idea that in the 1970s, there's no singular explanation for why Hispanic identity arose, right? It was the marketers, it was the bureaucrats, and it was the advocates, right? Who got together with Puerto Ricans, the Cubans, the Mexicans. And it's really interesting that this question wasn't officially on the census for 100% sample until 1980, right? So the whole idea that Latinos as an ethnic or racial group has always been with us is very socially constructed, right? And so it's a great story, and my students watch our presentation, and we critique it. This is the test format of what they're going to do in the next census. And what you notice is a couple of things, right? We don't have the ethnicity question. And second, every racial or ethnic group, and you can choose, you can say, I think this is a race or an origin, however you interpret it, is treated the same, right? You're white and you want to talk about your heritage, you write that in the box, right? Not just if you're Native American. You're Black, you're Haitian American, you write that in the box, right? That's there for everybody. So this is where we're headed, and this is what I think will be the thing. So anyway, email me in 2020 if I'm wrong. But this is probably what it's going to be. So we've gone from full circle of Latinos being an ethnicity, why wasn't it a race in the first place, to now they get to be their own category that could be treated effectively as race. Okay? And how did this happen? And how is it a two-way street, right? And again, Latinos are the biggest minority group right here at BYU. Okay, so I really connect this to the students' narrative. Okay, so there's a narrative right now, and this is just the one that's the most salient in terms of the news. The idea that there's a Latino threat narrative, even though the border crossings are down, tremendously, 80, 90%, and deportations are up. Unauthorized population is down because of the recession, because women in Mexico have 2.1 children, the same as the U.S. Lots of reasons. But what we point out is that only 2/3 of those unauthorized are Mexican and Central American, but they're 94% of those deported, right? So the strong argument is that that's a form of racism, right? The structural argument is, well, why is it that that's happening, right? And then the ignorant argument is, right, I have no idea that's happening, right? And we try to dispel that ignorance and get them to understand this. So we look a lot at the PBS series, Latino Americans. We look at that Cesar Chavez or Lourdes Huerta and how they said that we're going to take pride in having a brown identity We're not going to try to go on the white track like the Japanese, the Mormons, the Irish did. At that point in time, they break and they say, instead of struggling for whiteness, we're going to have our own identity. And so students get that. And they understand that in terms of monolingualism, linguistic incorporation, Latinos are really not that different from other groups. They are becoming English dominant over the generations. What's happening is they're hitting a ceiling when it comes to schooling and education, right? And different authors have different arguments. And a great book that we read is Jodi Vallejo's book, and she comes and does a little chat with our students afterwards about the Mexican-American middle class. And it's a huge group. Mexican Americans are now going to be a bigger group than Black Americans soon. And when they're middle class, they're looking to what? To other minority middle class members, not to white middle class members, to say, how can I retain my race or ethnicity and also be economically successful, right? The two don't have to be, right, mutually exclusive anymore, right? And that's the old assimilation model. So we do a lot of different theories, segmented, straight line assimilation, and so forth. Now back to this narrative, the Latino threat narrative. Only 17% of Latinos are undocumented, 3/4 of the undocumented are Latinos, and we have on the one hand, on the other hand. And we see that about half of the undocumented are living in these mixed status families. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but anybody who served in a Spanish branch or a Spanish ward, which I did for many years in New Jersey, knows that there are a lot of undocumented people living in this country in the shadows, and that this presents a particular challenge for policy and theory and racism, because the idea of just deporting people is impossible without separating from their children and so forth. So the church's statement, we go over that and how they put things in a certain order. My family is listed above laws and so forth. And we've been here before when we deported so many people in the 1930s, so we don't want to go there again, right? We don't want to commit that same mistake, right? And we read Ronald Takaki's book in Multicultural America, and they read all the details about this, and it starts to set in, right? That we're in a historical moment. Sociological imagination means you can't understand your own story without your biography intersecting, right, with the historical social process, right? And so they start to understand this better, okay? So there is a spectrum, right? So now you've noticed that historically race has been, that's it, right? I'm done with my talk, right? But the problem with race studies up till about the 1990s was people said, well, why aren't we interrogating what it means to be white? Hasn't that changed over time? Doesn't that say a lot about the problem? Isn't the location of the problem, right, just as much or more to do with the white dominant population? So I love that this screen is big enough that you can see this, right? What has happened here with our brightest minds in College Jeopardy? What have they left for last? African American history, and of course it has the hyphen in the middle, which I absolutely can't stand, putting a hyphen in the middle. Anyway, that's another topic, right? So they've all left this, and it gets back to what we talked about in the global breakout session, right? That history of African Americans, they say, is somebody else's history. It doesn't belong to me, right? I don't see it as my history or our history, okay? And they left it for last, okay? So Nell Irvin Painter literally wrote the book, The History of White People, a historian, and she makes the point in her op-ed last summer with Rachel Dolezal, which we're all forgetting now, who passed as being black, and Dylan Roof, right, that whites think that either I got no culture or I'm a racist terrorist, right, or a killer. And she says, let's set up a new framework. And right there in her article is the big picture, right, of the marches at Selma, right, which was a multiracial, multi-ethnic. And if you studied the civil rights movement in California, it was always many more Asians and Latinos than everybody thinks, right? It wasn't just black Americans. And so she starts to try to reframe things and narrates the history of whiteness in that little op-ed, right, that we use for our student reading. So what I start to do is to start to say to the students, right, you have a value system. You have a set of principles. You have a set of scriptures that talk about racial equality, right? You are a part of this, right? And when I say you, that actually applies to all of the students, not just the white students. You know why? Because those multiracial students often have a white ancestor, and the students who are not white often have grown up in a dominant white environment, right? So they start to recode and reinterpret what it means to be white and get a new definition of white identity, right? So this is me with my grandfather, who went to Ohio State and got his master's in sociology way back in the day. And he had the same track coach as Jesse Owens, and he was a man who was like not ahead of his time, but several generations ahead of his time. He always says saludos. He knew all the people in the community. This community went from a white community with few Latinos to a dominant Asian Latino community today in the San Gabriel Valley. He knew all the people in the library and the ethnic businesses. And he always held up two V's, right? Some of you know what the two V's are for, right? And I animated this part just for the suspense, right? So the two V's, right, were for V for victory over fascism in Europe and racism here at home. And as a kid, I'm going like, why is Grandpa always holding up two V's, right? But unbeknownst to me, that is a type of heritage and culture as a white American that I was inheriting, right? And from the pioneer side, understanding that side as well, right? So that starts to help students to see, right, that you can start to, I think somebody mentioned this earlier today, I can't remember where it was, right? We can change the culture, right, with a different worldview. And that's exactly what the gospel tells us to do, right? Bring all the good that you have, but if there's something that's a wicked tradition, right, you should not carry that on, right? That should not carry forward, right? And when I presented this at Black History Month, different stuff, you get there right there, you know, 4 kids preparing the dinner, like, we're going to talk to you right now about blacks being ordained to the priesthood, right? To our kids right then and there, and start to create a new narrative, okay? So these are all the activities we do. I'll just highlight a few. We talk about Elder Echo Hawk. We use his general conference address. They have to interview somebody of a different race and somebody of a different generation, same race. They have to understand, walk in somebody else's shoe. George Romney, if you went over to the management school, hardly any students would know that he was a big champion of racial immigration and housing. He fought for that. He put in structures in place of that. Ruby Bridges, was anybody there when she came, Ruby Bridges? I mean, she literally bore her testimony at the end. It's just like, we couldn't have paid her to say more perfect remarks. And the students really saw that, wow, Ruby Bridges, who integrated those schools in New Orleans, was animated by her faith. And they really started to see this as a two-way street, and they see the dialectic, right? Had the civil rights seminar, students come. We talked about Jeff Flake, Republican senator from Arizona, showing a lot of leadership on immigration. President Uchtdorf's statements on that. Race in the Priesthood essay is hard-coded into the syllabi of every class that I teach, that every student is going to read that statement, right? They're not going to finish my class without reading it. And all of these things, the films, we do Paul Reeve, and he came, and my student, the one who's multiracial, asked him point blank, was it a revelation? Asked a hard question. And I was so proud of my students for getting right to the core, right, of these issues. And so Ignacio comes, and he talks about his identity, and the students share why race is key to their own identity. And I'm going to pass around these handouts, and if you have a partner, you're going to have to share, because I only passed around. I mean, I only made up so many to try to save the earth here. So this is for every 2 or 3 people. So the students share why race matters to them. And this, I think, is the closing argument of my talk, right? If you didn't believe anything I said, if you thought everything was unique to sociology, right? Listen to what the students have to say. They're thinking about it every day, right? People are doing it on social media. They care about it. They want to talk about it. And they don't just want to talk about it as an add-on, as a touchy-feely thing. They want to know the material impact, right, of these things in their lives. And that comes from a lot of the white students are in the handout as well, especially those from diverse areas, okay? So as a strategy, we study, as an example, the Transcending Racial Barriers approach. Oxford University Press, I highly recommend it. Sociologists who have done decades of work now, and they say that, there is an approach, right? We have to have a common core. Can't just be all pluralism or all multiculturalism, because then we'll all just be, balkanizing our own little separate corners. We have to have a core. We have to talk about what that core means. Freedom, how that means liberation for African Americans, how it means freedom from taxes for certain white Americans, right? What that means, and get through that, and have true respect for all. They bring up all these examples. We read all these great quotes from the couples and families. I have interracial couples come to my class who are students at BYU, and they talk about these matters and so forth. And so it comes alive for them, and they see this as a negotiation, as a long-term process where we're starting this in our class, where they're learning this. And the military is a great example that has institutionalized this approach into everything that they do. And so we studied the example of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and I made the fatal mistake, as you all know, of not preloading a video. So we'll get the spinning pinwheel of death here, if the link even works, which it probably doesn't. But anyway, we don't have time for these videos anyway, but in this neighborhood initiative in Boston, they were community hidden red mine, arson profit, dumping ground for Boston, very disadvantaged. And they turned everything around. They're a national model for good organizing, urban planner studies example, and they hardwired diversity in their institutions. They all said we can get around a few things. It doesn't matter that the Cape Verdean people have their own radio show or speaking their own language. It doesn't matter that people have this diversity. We have a common core, right? And they created something that had 0 foreclosures, and they had youth involved, and they said, we want to make everybody an agent of change. And the students start to discuss out loud, and it really helps them with the introductory students especially. I mean, the advanced students by now are ready to take this and run with it, but the introductory students are like, wow, my whole life I've just been thinking science, society, something in my Sunday school lesson, very narrow-minded. When they see somebody else practicing those principles and they apply it to race, then they start to get a bigger vision of saying, wow, this project of reconciliation belongs to me and my values, right? I'm a part of this, okay? So to conclude, right, we try to help those students meet the challenge themselves. They do this group project on and off campus, and that's been a great success in terms of civic engagement, with getting involved, going to the Genesis group, being involved with Capoeira. I mean, it doesn't matter, the whole spectrum. They've done things in the community here on campus. They do a lot of digital dialogues, quiet writings, longer essays, and the most important thing is that in class, right, this second day of class, I do a lot about my background and who I am and where I'm coming from, why I'm passionate, so that they feel safe and sharing. And they do that, and they open up. And what you've seen here are largely all unprompted quotes, right? This was not under the gun coercion, I want you to share. This was very much volunteered by the students, what you see in these quotes. So my main tagline today, and I think I'm going to end right, exactly what I wanted to, is that I want the students to reframe their identity, right? And that applies especially to the white students, but to every student, as an ally in a multiracial struggle. Rediscover their values. I didn't do the whole scripture chain because you guys already know the doctrinal support for what I'm talking about. And then reapply their values through learning exercises, through everything that they're doing to understand why this matters, right? And we study all different arguments, and we make them understand that these are just the arguments of the authors, right? They use our own values to interpret what it is, but when we do the case for reparations approach, which is based on John Locke and the scriptures and the Quakers and the Germans doing reparations to the Jewish, we make the point that, if you do a political science or economics cost-benefit analysis, right, if we solve some of these problems with respect to race, right, we would solve, right, criminal problems, health problems, education problems, right? So they start to see there is a bigger rationale for, right, not sweeping this under the rug and addressing it. We would have fewer inequalities and other spheres, right? And so that's kind of what we're headed to, right? So do these slides, handouts help you? I want to know that. First off, just your immediate feedback. What can we do to help students see the importance of this? Obviously, when I'm in my 111 class, we're just spending 2 weeks on this, not 14 weeks. What can we do to help them understand this? How have you achieved meaningful racial integration experiences towards racial reconciliation, race relations? And with that, I will pause for your comments, questions. Thank you. Yes.
I don't have an answer to any of those questions, but I just want to iterate. I would like to hear the answers to that. I noticed one of the comments somebody wrote there is, this is the widest place I've ever been. And that's my experience, and I teach history, and so things come up, and I uncover what I consider to be very racist attitudes amongst our students. Naively racist, I think, from just growing up in Utah County or something like that. And I don't know how to get them out of their thinking, right? I just don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
They've never truly interacted. What they know about Latinos or what they know about Black people or what they know about Pacific Islanders is all stereotypes.
Well, there's a lot of answers, but just the undocumented immigration issue, I mean, we just start with the fact that there's 2.5 million children that are undocumented. The age of accountability is a principle everybody agrees on, right? They didn't come here through any fault of their own.
Yeah.
And then in the digital dialogues, it is amazing. We have a student who's from Samoa whose uncle was deported. We have somebody who's from Ireland who was undocumented, right?
Yeah.
We have somebody whose parent was in the Border Patrol who says, don't believe all the lies in the media. It's the lowest it's been, right? They back up everything. So it's pretty amazing when you get the dialogue going based off of facts, what can happen. But that immigration issue is the one issue where unprompted, unaided, without me trying to lead them in one direction, that is the one issue where the students say, I'm a Republican, I'm a moderate, I'm unaffiliated, I'm whatever, right? I'm going to register to vote. I'm going to be more educated. I'm going to read the newspaper like you said President Hinckley did, right? I'm going to start to be a part of this instead of just being a bystander, right? It is pretty amazing how that issue resonates. So I try to start with that as a kind of entree issue, and then we can get to the harder stuff with African Americans and the Tulsa race riots and the Native American genocide. Because if you just start with, we murdered all the Native Americans without getting there, and when I say we, I mean our society, right? I want to be careful of that term, right? That is too much. They walk in, they say, well, I wasn't even alive, right? And in our upper division race class, we really tackle that critique of, well, that was back then, right? And we really show how the stuff that's happening is ongoing right now, and there's no way any one of us can say we're not participating in the system.
Can I just follow up? So
Yeah.
I'm interested in colonial history, that's my era, and I find students do find understanding the complexity of the Native American experience in the colonial era or an earlier time period that yes, people were participants, all of that. But then we get to the modern day by the end of the semester, and they're like, oh, all Indians are drunk. You know, it's modern day that they carry these, and I just don't know how to address them.
Well, we just read
I
it
like
in.
your
Yeah.
notion of just, bring it up first.
Yeah, and we do the Washington football team
Yeah.
controversy. Let me say that correctly. And we bring up that the leader of the Oneida Nation went to Harvard Law School. He's got, millions and millions. He can litigate the NFL. So basically what we illustrate is that this guy has white privilege in terms of his social networks and his social resources, and he's flipping the script and turning that white privilege to go against, and he'll fight this to the end, right? Even though he's Native American, right? And so then they start to understand, oh, now I see how everything I learned maps onto this issue. Yeah. We had a question over here. Yeah, thanks.
Do you face any direct pushback from students when you try to explicitly bring in scripture and the words of the prophets to support some of these ideas which may be challenging or preconceived?
No, less so.
He's manipulating the gospel to try to support.
No, less so. Even in the written comments. I mean, early years when I was practicing, right, I got more stuff, and I figured out how to avoid that.
How do you avoid that?
Well, I mean, how do you, right? You have to build that relationship, right? And I think Alan's talked about this earlier today. It has to be a meaningful relationship with the students. And you also structure things in a way where, if you are going to be the person in class who's going to disrupt class with your knee-jerk reactions or, ignorant viewpoint, right, you're going to lose all your points too, right? Some of those students need an incentive as well. No, they've never gotten that. And I think really watching that Nobody Knows in the introductory level class with the Untold Story of Black Mormons really helps, because they're like, wow, if all of these Black Mormons have kept the faith, right? When their congregation said, no, you can't attend with us, and they still wanted to pay tithing, right? If all these Black Mormons can keep the faith, I really need to back up and understand things better. So those are a few ways. And when I do the scriptures, I never do it in a formulaic way. I always try to organically. I do it at the beginning of the class. I don't say every class I'm going to share a scripture at this point in time and stand behind the pulpit and go into church mode, right? That's not how I do it. And that helps too. Yeah, Evan?
I was just going to say the oral histories from the Brazilian saints say the exact same thing.
Yeah, and people say Nigeria as well. Yeah. Comment here, Dan? Yeah.
So, how do you deal with the multidimensionality of identity, right? Because these students also have gender identities, national identities, language identities, etc. And all those things are very important as well. And so, as I think about, okay, well, my class is about race at all, really, so, but it ought to be something about identity. So, yours is about race, so maybe it's appropriate to ask you, how do you deal with those other dimensions of identity?
I'll tell you a great example, and I'm so glad you asked that question so I could bring up the example. So we look at Brazil in only one class, and I'm not an expert on Brazil, but we look at their racial stratification system, and this will speak to other dimensions here in a moment. And Brazil is the largest majority African origin country, the second largest, after Nigeria, right? So majority of Brazilians are Afro-Brazilian, right? The second biggest black country in the world after Nigeria. But the magazine stands venerate whiteness, right? The TV, right? Everything in the history does that. And so we asked the students, how is the color line in the United States changing, right? It was black-white, it was white non-white. Now what is it? Is it black non-black? One book says that multiracial Americans, right, the Latinos and the Asians, they intermarry, they can get the symbolic ethnicity, it's blacks that are left out. Other people say no. It's actually what we're doing in the U.S. is we're moving to the Latin American experience. It's a triracial order where there's a big middle group with a lot of mobility within that group, right? So a lot of people can make it higher in that group, and so they say, well, there's no problem with having a triracial category because there's a lot of mobility, right? Even though blacks, Southeast and Asian refugees, native reservation-bound Native Americans are at the bottom, And so how that brings in other identities is this, right? I point out that that racial stratification system where, you know, the Mexicans that have 1 million black Mexicans say that race doesn't matter, right, is just like our class system, right? We have a upper and a lower class, and we have a huge middle class, and that buffers the conflict and why we don't have the same things we see in Europe and so forth. So they start to see that, wow, I can apply the idea of social class, a tri-system, to race to understand it better, and then they can say, well, how does my privilege in terms of gender or class? And I always have a digital dialogue or an activity where I overlap race and gender, race and education, race and other things, so that I want them to do the intersectionality, but obviously at the undergraduate level, we do not hold a candle to what we should do with intersectionality like you would in a graduate program, right? Because everybody has a certain set of status or privilege that comes from different identities. Yeah, so that's some of the things that we try to do. And of course, just the whole religion and reframing with religion, I try to bring that in terms of identity. Yeah?
You have a slide on defining ethnic and religious identities. Is our faith an adjective or a noun?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what would you want it to be?
I don't know. You're answering the question.
Experienced teacher, right? He knows about the reflection thing. I think it's both. I think it's both. I mean, I think in terms of identity, it is an adjective. I think in terms of them, introductory students, especially as a building block, it's a noun. It starts with a noun. Like, here's a set of things that you believe, and how do we apply it, right? But if I can get them at the end to see that adjective connected just as important as the other stuff we study, then I've succeeded, right? And the students in those handouts that share those core values are the ones that have gotten there, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So here's a real life question. How do we deal with the inherent racism that is rolling up now in this current presidential race?
Yeah, that's why I do the immigration unit. I mean, in the immigration unit, the students really, they open up to and they say, you know, I've heard one side of the story my whole life. And that's why I don't pretend to do a false dichotomy of I'm going to bring in an opposing viewpoint and give you false balance, right? I am very open about saying I'm representing my discipline, and the research from my discipline is on one side of the coin on this issue, right? That race has everything to do with our immigration laws, right? That if Canadians were dying in Montana at 400 people per year, it would be a national emergency, right? But because 400 Mexicans die in Arizona every year, it is not, right? That has something to do with race. We bring that up in a way that's subtle, in a way that doesn't threaten them, that tries to help. But I mean, I think if I were in a poli-sci class with elections, I would be a little more direct, but I try to be the indirect route on that. I found it well, and I really use the Jeff Flake example a lot. My cousin knows him pretty well as somebody, because I really want my students to know, right, even if they think, and I don't tell them what my political party is, right, I really want them to know that there's not good guys, bad guys here, right? There's the opportunity for leadership, right? President Reagan was the one who signed our last immigration reform, right, who showed leadership on this issue.
Yeah. Take it beyond BYU, though.
Yeah.
Beyond BYU, because apparently the late night talk show hosts aren't having much impact on
Yeah, it's a tough issue. But I mean, if young people are voting at, 20%, I mean, that's part of the problem, right? So thanks so much, Susie, for giving me this chance to present.